Welcome to Blackbird, episode number 40. My name is James, and today I am excited to bring back to the show LB Muñiz. LB is, of course, one of my favorite guests to have on the show, and I promise you this won't be the last time he's here. We have been on each other's shows a couple of times, and we always just have really good conversations. In this one, I wanted to talk to him about some criticisms that we've had of libertarian strategy, and in particular, the LP Mises Caucus strategy. And also, I wanted to talk to him about his thoughts on intersectionality, which he's written about back in October and hasn't really expanded on in his podcast like he usually does. So I wanted to bring him on to my podcast so that we can chat. Before we get into this conversation, though, let me tell you about Renegade University's Texas Weekend. If you want to hang out with me, Thad Russell, Buck Johnson, Scott Horton, Cody Wilson, who ended the gun control debate, the great economic historian Deirdre McCloskey, Hotep Jesus, and Jack the Perfume Nationalist, who you might not be familiar with, but I promise you you'd like to be, head over to blackbirdpodcast.com/RUTexas to sign up. I have attended one of Thad Russell's weekends in Washington, D.C., and I tell you, it's the time of my life. You have educational seminars, you go out for dinner and drinks, you may or may not consume other substances. It is just a ton of fun. There's going to be about 100 people there. We're going to be hanging out on Buck Johnson's property and eating some of the best barbecue in the world in the barbecue capital of the world, Lockhart, Texas. So I'd love to see you there. Head to blackbirdpodcast.com/RUTexas to sign up today. And with that, here is my conversation with Mr. LB Muñiz. LB, welcome back.
James, I'm happy to be here without a hangover.
Yeah, well, we worked through those in our own little individual ways this morning, so that's great.
Yes,
We were texting last night from our respective bars and clubs. Postponing this interview was probably a good decision.
Yeah, I'm in the Uber, and I'm like, you know what? I don't want to be that guy. I'm just gonna text him now and be like, dude, I don't think I can make 11 a.m. Let's do noon, because I know I can wake up and be ready to go by noon. It's I can be like at a customer at 8 a.m. with a hangover, but I don't have to like think deeply.
There's not a lot
in my day job. So, well, that's not entirely true, but not like this.
All right. So it's been a long time since we talked last, like a couple months. I think the interview I posted much more recently, and that's because there was like at least a month or so gap between our actual interview and or conversation really, and the time that I posted it, just because I was being very delinquent, and thank God for Podsworth Media getting me on my toes as far as releasing these things on time. It seems like the libertarian world has kind of blown up since then. So yeah, why don't we kind of start there? You tweeted or posted on your Substack a quick piece about just don't be poor.
Yep.
Basically. It's kind of Matt Erickson's solution to everything is if you don't like the government, make the taxes irrelevant. Why don't you kind of, I guess, first summarize that and your kind of take on it?
So this has been, and to take another step back, like, okay, there's this side on more the theoretical, just actors, us content creators trying to create content, I guess, work in the space, advance ideas. There's that aspect of it, but then a couple weeks before that, we also did see a legitimate scandal in the structure of the LP as well. Since the last time we talked on a show, so it's kind of interesting to see it on both in multiple elements. This is manifesting itself in multiple elements of this larger libertarian space. So basically, for episode 100, Clint Russell made a great choice, and he had on two people who his audience was going to hate. Right, because Clint is very like, I don't listen to his show a lot, but from my interviews with him, he's very like just in this space of LPMC. Nothing wrong with it. I'm a part of it myself. Of this LPMC, like in the tradition of Dave Smith, if you will. And it's kind of it's just a show that isn't going to want to necessarily hear what the other guys were saying. And both the other guys are kind of I think they're doing different things. If anybody is a careful reader, they'll notice that I did only, other than the fact that I tagged him and that I mentioned that he was part of it in the piece, I don't address anything that Cyprian, or who's formerly known as Vin Armani, I don't really address any of his claims or any of his arguments, and I've kind of done that on purpose in writing. I could get into it now, but so I'm focused on what Matt said because that's the clip that went viral.
Sure, and you're a Jason Stapleton fan, right?
Yes, yeah. I've listened to Jason, so that's where it's one of those interesting things. Is I've consistently listened to Jason Stapleton and Dave Smith over the last few years, and so I guess have like I would say maybe a more unique perspective of kind of understanding the context of what Matt is talking about. Maybe not necessarily in his king-pilled context, but certainly in this wealth creation, this application of liberty to building wealth, power, and influence. I'm a believer in it. I think there's a lot of practical experience there and a lot of practical advice, but it's not for everyone, right? Like one of the first things that, that's part of the idea is like, everything, it's your fault. If you don't like where you are, it's not the fault of the people around you. It's your fault. Take the responsibility and then figure out what you can do from there. And on a personal note, leaving aside the theoretical argument, it's that kind of a mindset shift has legitimately helped me become a better, more professional person, more productive person as a result of it. Is pushing myself. I've thought about having a show for years, but it was listening to a show like Jason's that was like, you know what? I am good enough to do this. I can actually dedicate myself and do 365 days of content, which I reminded myself recently that I've pretty much kept up with, save a few days, that I've posted at least a tweet every single day this year, including, 4 articles a week, a podcast, interviews, and things like that. But so I think that's the thing, is I think the message was lost. And I think Matt Erickson knew what he was doing when he was saying, your problem is that you don't want the people who aren't looking. Here's what I've witnessed with this, because I guess maybe let's read the quote, right? That might be the best thing to do here. And I wrote it out so I can do it. So he's criticizing it, and he's saying, we just want to spread liberty. I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means to spread liberty. Okay, that's kind of a rhetorical thing. It works. But this is the point that everybody went over, as people are fond of saying. You don't have liberty, you have the liberty to do something. So what do you want to do that you can't do right now? And a lot of people will point to, like, income. They'll go and say they don't want to be taxed. It's not that you don't want to be taxed, it's that you want to have more money than you have right now. And when you're being taxed, it's making you have less money. So why don't you make more money? And they'll take some of your money, but why don't you make so much money that taxation is an inconvenience? That's what everybody went crazy over. And he's expounded on this later, and it's very obvious in a sense. It's this idea of, unless you're born a libertarian, and God bless you if you are, you're not born into the sense, and you're not born into an understanding that taxation is theft. That's not something that, it's not like understanding that a snake might harm you, right? Like, it's not the same kind of information. It's so what he said elsewhere, and I agree with. It's like, okay, so you go, you work, you get your first paycheck, and some of the money's taken out because it's going to taxes. And then, you say, hey, what's this? And then somebody comes along and says, hey man, did you know taxation is theft? It's like, yeah, taxation is theft because they stole this from me. And by the way, they are stealing that from you. But what does that mean? And that's a great principle to hold up to and to ascribe to. But how do you actually achieve a sense of autonomy, which is to say a sense of freedom in your life? And one answer to that is obviously have money and have wealth, more importantly, and have skills that keep you employed, and more specifically, build your human capital and make sure you have valuable skills that are rare and specialized, so that people want to hire you, and that so you can choose what you want to do with your life. I think in any discipline, in any idea, I find that to be a very empowering thing. I really do. But I also understand where, if you're on the wrong side of that conversation, it's really tough to hear. Because guess what? It was really tough for me to hear at first too. And I make a specific mention in the piece of like my personal story of having like a mountain of student debt for no good reason. And like I pay a very nice mortgage payment every single month to my loan servicer. And I believe that's an injustice. I believe it's unjust that I have to pay these student loans back.
Mhm.
And I could not pay those loans and have horrible credit and have my grandparents' credit be destroyed, so where they can't get the things that they need to get, and to where they, to where I can't get a credit card and I can't travel, or, it's difficult for me to find good housing. Or I can suck it up. I can work my butt off. I can make sure that I'm keeping focused on things that make me money, and I can, figure things out. And for a long time, I was struggling. And finally, it's how does everything happen? A little bit and then all at once. And now I'm in a position where I'm relatively comfortable. I'm not where I want to be in regards to my finances, but that weight off my shoulder is, in fact, what enabled me to do my show now and to write the content that I'm writing, because I have this weight off my back of I don't know how I'm going to pay the rent. I don't know how I'm going to afford to live on my own as a man, by myself. I'm going to have to rely on people like my parents for these ideas really, they eat away at you, and they eat away at your sense of self. And so it's really important to me that I work hard to be something that I want to be. And I think that's the spirit of what he's talking about. And he's purposefully saying it in such a way to trigger what he's referring to as people who only conceptualize themselves as being antagonistic to the state, which is to say, you're not pro-liberty, you're anti-state. And I also think it's triggering a particular dogmatism. And this is the point of the piece, by the way, which is hilarious, because immediately everybody's going crazy and saying, but what about this point? It's like, okay, the point I address is that this is obviously triggering a cognitive dissonance. In my mind, these ideas are reconcilable. I've already reconciled them myself because I've been listening to both, to all these different people for all this time. These points are reconcilable. Capitalists, of course, believe, or proponents of free markets believe, that you should be able to accumulate wealth and you should be able to have, the life that you want to live, provided you do it ethically. So what's so complicated about saying it? Well, it's the particular way in which he's saying it. He's actually striking at a dogma of libertarian ideology, which is to say, taxation is theft. And so if you say anything that justifies taxation in any way, you're going to react against it because you view the person as an antagonist. You're entering the conversation antagonistically. You're not entering the conversation in a frame of understanding. You're entering the conversation as, how can I prove this person wrong? And if you do that, you're going to figure out how to prove somebody wrong very, very easily.
Okay, so yes, everything that Matt Erickson and that you said is true. The problem is Matt Erickson was addressing Dave Smith and his fans. And Dave Smith and his fans aren't focused on taxation. Yeah, they do think taxation is theft, but there's not a single Dave Smith fan who would say that taxation is their number one issue, or that, maybe I should go become an entrepreneur. Maybe that's the best way for me to live the best life for myself. Like, everybody kind of knows that. Mm-hmm. What Dave Smith and his fans are talking about is the fact that people are locked in cages for drugs, that children in Yemen are being slaughtered, that people are being murdered by police. All the wealth, power, and influence in the world isn't going to fix that. So why, when Vin Armani and Matt Erickson are sitting here building these straw men, do they not address those very important issues that are the actual focus of Dave Smith and his followers?
Branding. I mean, I think in part of it, it's that. I think if you were to actually bring them into a conversation, Jason just had Michael Malice on his show to talk about the Anarchist Handbook. Mm. And so I'd encourage people to take a look at that, because you'll see Matt in a context where he's speaking with somebody who he respects, and somebody who has the intellectual ammunition to back up what he has to say. Mm. Right? So there's this there's also an element of how well can you express yourself as well. I'm making my focuses here on Matt and defending this specific point, because I disagree with a lot of what Cyprian said in that interview. I don't think a lot of what he said was particularly profound. It is this is something that we talked about the first time we spoke, and I've said this a few times now. There is power in the Word of God, and that's something what I'm witnessing right now is a lot of people discovering the power of the Word of God again. And this is when I mistakenly referred to as, on your show, Samuel L. Jackson when it was Denzel Washington in the Book of Eli.
Oh, yeah.
But it's, which I still can't believe I did. But if you listen to my show, you'll notice that I get names wrong all the time. It's very easy, right? Like religion exists for a reason. And part of that reason is that it gives you all the answers. So it's very easy when you enter the religious world, especially as you re-enter a religious world where you're kind of just coming upon these ideas again, to let yourself get carried away. And there's also the propensity for people to abuse the word of God, which we've witnessed, name any preacher, right? You can find examples of preachers of various sorts. I remember listening to stories of people who one day the preacher just left and had taken all the money of the church, and we had been going to that church for a while, right? Nothing about the word of God means that you don't. How do I want to say this? Just because you're speaking the word of God doesn't mean that you are a man of God. I think you do. I think you demonstrate that through your actions. And for me, at least, it involves speaking with love. And that's something that I personally, I have a temper. I can get really, I could do a show that's very bombastic and very firebrand, but I don't, because I want to speak with love, and I don't want to insult people out of turns. So there was a lot said in that interview that I disagree with. But like I said, I think in a certain extent, there is something to be said for the fact that if I'm in a situation where I'm kind of going into an antagonistic audience, it makes more sense long-term for me to stick to my guns rather than give a little bit to the other side. I don't agree with that strategy, but it is a logical strategy, and it's effective. That's the way I interpret it, because like I said, I'm a fan of Dave Smith in the piece. I give both of them money.
Yeah.
I find utility to both. I don't completely agree with the prescription that there is no utility in organizing with the LP. I don't completely agree with that, but I don't completely agree that reigniting the Ron Paul revolution is going to create a wave of change across the country. I'd like to see that happen. That would be great. But what I do and what I'm trying to do and what all I ever try to do is I've said, I want to make sure the people who don't want to get left behind don't get left behind. Mm. And I want to try and I want the ideas of human freedom and human flourishing they need a home, and people need to carry these ideas forward, because those ideas are kind of what have created the civilization that we enjoy today. I would argue. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I think so. It's still, I think that Matt's speech that you quoted on your piece is true, and also is not responding to Dave Smith.
Correct.
And to me, so for instance, when he says, I don't know what it means to spread liberty to do what? You don't have liberty. You have liberty to do something. That's not true.
I agree.
That's a false statement. Liberty as a concept is something. I think that we would say that it's the absence of aggression.
Well, I think Dave put this out. Yeah, well, and Dave put this out Dave put this perfectly in his interview with Pete Quinones, where he said, dude, what are you doing? You're spreading ideas. There's this element of, if you have any kind of a public face and you are trying to produce content for the public to consume, you are in the business of spreading ideas, right? Yeah. So obviously you can spread an idea like liberty. What that is in my mind is, he's just reframing. He's trying to reframe the idea to move the conversation forward. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think there's but okay, so let's contend with the question though. How do you achieve liberty in your lifetime? Right?
Well, you achieve personal liberty by building wealth. And then, power and influence, obviously, those are as nebulous as liberty. Well, power to do what? Influence over whom?
Yeah.
So I would say that Matt is right. Achieving individual liberty is often about either achieving wealth or achieving some degree of autonomy, such that you are separated from these institutions of control.
Mm-hmm.
So agorism is a great way to do that as well. You don't have to be rich to be an agorist. You just have to be to be willing to sacrifice those creature comforts.
I'm so glad you said rich though, and this is again where maybe I have the benefit of kind of understanding the totality of kind of this way of thinking or this mindset, if you will, which is again a very practical mindset. This isn't trying to answer the big questions of the world, which is still something that I like to try and do. But this is how do you actually do this in practice and with you. But I'm glad you said rich, because as we well know, as students of economics, wealth is a relative concept. Wealth isn't absolute. There is no fixed pie. Wealth is relative. So the term wealth is used, as an idea, as a placeholder. In practice, it doesn't mean you're making, gobs of money, right? It could just mean, again, that you have the ability to take a vacation when you want. Or like my occupation kind of allows me flexibility in my schedule. I don't have to be anywhere at a set time. And that's really helpful to me, and it makes me more productive. The fact that I don't have to get to the office at 8 a.m. on the dot. I can be in my kitchen making coffee, taking a phone call before I head into the office to do other work. Like that's an element of this as well. And it's and it's also a question of the type of work that you do. So I don't know that it's not so much that they're irreconcilable, it's that they're different conversations, right? And so and I don't know. This is one of those like interesting things where you're not going to get me to defend everything about like the king pill mentality, because I don't think I'm an adherent of it, right? Like I hear some things I like, I hear some things I don't like, and as I say in the piece, I want to how did I put it? Like I want to cohere things. I want to harmonize things that go together, and I want to reject and I want to throw away things that are discordant. So I think it's completely harmonious to say that, in this broader libertarian space, you as an individual should, if you want, you don't have to, I'm not forcing you to do anything, you should want to achieve the most for yourself in your life. And that looks different to different people.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, if tomorrow you told me that, hey, I'm going to give you your salary right now, your student debt is going to go away, but you have to live in a van for 5 years, touring the country, I'd take that deal in a heartbeat. Like it's one of the, it's like it doesn't have to be the yacht, it doesn't have to be the mansion, it doesn't have to be the Lamborghini, right? This is the caricature of that's the caricature of capitalism that the socialist makes. Is that wealth only has to be for wealth means the 1%. Well, you don't have to be in the 1% to live a good life. You just live, but you do live a better. You have a higher standard of living. Let's be technical. If you are in the 1% than somebody that's in the 10%.
And wealth comes in forms other than money. I mean, you can have a wealth of time. You can have a wealth of like open space. I mean, if you're living in a cabin in the middle of the woods and not being bothered by anybody, you have $0 to your name, but you are living the life that you want to live, then you're wealthier than you or I, who are burdened with student loan debt, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain king pill?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I read an article, and I haven't really watched the King Pill YouTube channel or listened to the podcast very much. But I think essentially it is that, like, you are the king of your domain. I think it is that, and it is also, I've heard him say that we are built to serve a king, which but again, and he uses that in a religious frame, and there's something to that really, I don't know, it strikes a chord in me, this idea, right? But yeah, but you're right, it is the other aspect of you're the king of your own domain, but also who are you serving? He's all the other. Yeah, I wouldn't want to try and express the philosophy in full, because I haven't bothered to. I haven't gotten a full idea of it. I've more listened to his criticisms of the liberty sphere, and kind of just taken those. But I mean, I think I'm sure it relates, because he said it. It relates to Mencius Moldbug's critiques of liberalism, which I'm not super familiar with. I can only have a understanding only through these people, that really through these guys, because when I hear Mencius Moldbug talk, I just find I just hear an interesting person. So I've never heard him articulate like his patchwork anarchy idea, or what is it? Is that what it is? Patchwork monarchy.
I guess is like the culmination of his thought.
Yeah, I haven't read his older stuff. I'm reading. I'm currently devouring Gray Mirror, but I haven't read Unqualified Reservations. So
yeah, and so it's like, so I think I don't. There's this element of, okay, so I said this on the episode a few weeks ago that I recorded with my cousin. But it's like, okay, so we need a king again. Like, so we're just going to go, and so they'll be like, yes, because we're going through the circle and it's the fourth turning. And I'm not knocking the fourth turning, but I am going to point out that Glenn Beck was talking about the fourth turning in 2014. It was all he could talk about, right?
Yeah,
like, so,
it was on LouRockwell.com around that time too.
Right. So like, these ideas are not necessarily, they might be new to you, right? Because you're just coming upon them, but it's like, so you're saying we should be Christians and we should check out the fourth turning. It's like, okay, so are we cultural conservatives? No, and I'm being disparaging when I say that.
Sure.
Right. But I'm doing that to point out the fact that it's not that we're the only ones to have contended with these ideas, or, the only people who are even trying to conceptualize things in terms of a turning, which is, from what I can tell, a little bit more what they're driving at is that we're, and something that I agree with is I do think we're at like a turning of the world. I think that the progressive, I just put it differently. I think the progressive order, if you will, of the last 100 years is failing us, right? Like this experiment in monetary policy is failing. It's not, and it could be that it's just running its course. Maybe it's just a question of diminishing returns.
Yeah.
Right? Why isn't that a logical thing to assume that when we have this, we have this overarching world order that's incredibly complex, that it wouldn't, have a life cycle to it. Maybe it is, we seem to look at history and see that various civilizations and societies have a natural life cycle to them. I'm not going to put hard and fast times on that, because I think that's tea leaves. I think that's divination.
What do you think of their claim that Dave Smith is radicalizing or is going to start the next Proud Boys, and that these Proud Boys are going to be armed and dangerous?
You can say that about anything.
Yeah.
That's so. I don't find that to be particularly profound.
Okay. So I think what I'm getting from you is that this particular little passage that you excerpted from Matt Erickson on that podcast is what you're focusing on. You're not focusing on the kids in Yemen. Mm-hmm. You're not focusing on Federal Reserve policy.
Of course.
And I guess really you're taking an individualist approach to it. Yeah. Like that's the thing that a methodological individualist would latch onto, really.
And more importantly, and here's the key, is I specifically say in the piece that I'm purposefully not addressing other things. I'm trying to focus in on one thing to try and demonstrate a broader point. And in the point, I'm talking about cognitive dissonance, which is something that we as humans face on a regular basis, right? Like that's cognitive dissonance is more fundamental to humanity than taxation being theft.
Sure.
If you will. So it's a question of causality. And that causality is actually what I talk about in the piece that you wanted to discuss, which is why we don't need intersectionality. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, why I've said this for probably 6 years, I like to say the last thing I am is a libertarian.
Yeah.
Because I'm all these other things before I'm that. And everybody is that.
Before we switch to that, because I do want to get into it, because you promised us your Teaming Millions podcast episode on these pieces, and there was a damn presidential
And one
debate.
more point, and because I'm trying to increase my profile, I particularly wrote the piece that way. Like when I send the tweet out and I say, a 1 minute clip, but on Liberty Lockdown with Cyprian and Matt Erickson, talking about Dave Smith tore libertarianism apart. Obviously, I'm trying to get you to read my piece, and it worked because it's it's going to probably be one of my highest pieces that I write in my first year of doing the Been Awake project.
Yeah, I mean, if it was 2020, a piece on COVID would have been that, but now it's a piece on libertarian divisions. So that's where you're going to get your eyeballs.
Sorry, but you were asking. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no. Where does the cognitive dissonance come in? I was not following this controversy. Like I listened to the interview because I am fascinated by Matt Erickson's thought, and I haven't watched enough of him. And I've been an on again, off again fan of Vin or Cyprian for the better part of a year. So I wanted to know what they had to say. One problem with me is that I'm very easily influenced. Like I take after my mom in the sense that I would probably be the first in line to join a new cult if I didn't have my guards up. And she's super into the QAnon phenomenon. And, if I was in a different state in my life, I could see myself also being a Q guy. So I have to, in order to keep my brain healthy and my own like individual autonomy intact, I have to approach people like Vin and Matt, who are very charismatic, and Dave Smith as well, who are charismatic and persuasive. I can't just take what they say at face value. Otherwise, I fall into like fanboyism where, and I did this last year. I mean, you can ask my partner. Like everything was Vin Armani all the time. I was watching his, and there's some value in that. Like the Fourth Turning is much older than the Fourth Turning book that was written in the 90s. It goes all the way back to the Indian caste system, which we can talk about if you'd like. Although I think Vin was on my show and did a pretty good explanation of it. So anyway, I listened to that episode of Liberty Lockdown. I didn't catch that there was a lot of libertarian cognitive dissonance, especially about this taxation part. That doesn't seem like something that would be controversial.
So why was everybody going crazy? Why was this the dumbest argument that you ever heard?
What were people even saying? I didn't even know that it was happening.
This is so. I mean, in the piece, I put the tweet that shows the clip, and it's a profile. Life's in the woods. Know nothing about the individual who's responsible for that account, but it was posted, the 1 minute clip, which I read. I read the little quote from, and it says, "This is the dumbest argument I've ever heard." So for the context of my piece, that's what I'm writing about. But, and I did purposefully label one of the sections, headed one of the sections, "the point." And I said, and all the response, and it's also, my piece as well is also, again, more of a reaction to the responses I also received, where I said, what did I say? Hang on, let me make sure I get it right. If you think Real King Pilled is dumb for arguing a solution to taxation, which I probably wouldn't have used the word solution if I had proofread before I tweeted this, is to make more money, you're purposefully not understanding him. It follows that applying liberty means building wealth. That's not I think everybody is taking that as exclusive. I don't intend that as exclusive, right? It's not only that you need to build wealth. It's kind of like, it's again Milton Friedman's critique of free markets are necessary but not sufficient for a free society. But cognitive dissonance is a bitch is how I ended the piece. And what I say in the point is, part of cognitive dissonance is that you ignore conflicting information, but it was surprising the degree to which people were completely misunderstanding the point being made in that moment. Perhaps the rest of the conversation muddied the waters too much, but the whole idea of pulling a clip is that what is being said in that particular moment is what's at issue. The irony is that was one of the least contentious things said from a libertarian perspective. And the point is, for me, is that's where I think skepticism comes in. And skepticism and like having that natural or building those muscles of questioning the information you're receiving is that's the bulwark for me of not getting too swept away by one ideological possession or another. And I've had my moments, right? Like I've had my Jordan Peterson deep dive. I've had my Dave Smith deep dive, my Tom Woods deep dive, where, this person is everything to me. And we talked about Stefan Molyneux on the last show, and I went through a long period of listening to everything that he was putting out. And there's nothing there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's, I think if you want to be a whole person, right, and you want to take ownership of your thought, you don't have to take ownership of your thought and your mind if you don't want to. I'm not telling you to do that. But if you'd like to, because I believe ignorance is bliss, by the way. But if you want to, like the way you achieve that is not by just reacting to things, but trying to reflect upon something and be like, what is this person trying to do when he's saying this right now? And I don't. So that's again, it's a very narrow case I'm making, and I think there's utility in driving into that narrow piece to try and create a broader idea. So it's ignoring that conflicting information. Obviously, we want to make money, right? So why is it that libertarians, ostensible libertarians are rejecting that idea? And what I get back is, well, he said this somewhere else, and he's what was the one it was the gentleman Jeremiah, who I think I'm going to go on his show. It was like, well, but he said taxation isn't theft. I'm like, okay, but I know that's not entirely true. What he says is render unto Caesar, which is a completely separate idea. It's like listen, these waters, if we're gonna analogize and we're gonna talk about like scuba diving, right? Like, the deeper you go, the tougher it is to accomplish a task. And so the deeper we get into ideas, because ideas they're not neatly categorized the way that rocks and plants are, it can be muddy and it can get difficult. And one thing that what I try to do when I'm processing this information is act out that idea of Plato's Socrates, which is the midwife of ideas. Mm-hmm. So if I hear something that I'm like, that's kind of interesting, how can I take this to make the best case for it? It's steel manning and making sure that I'm steel manning an argument before I bother criticizing it. And again, this isn't to the larger context, because there are things that I disagreed with in that post, in that interview. But I don't see what's so wrong. I don't see what's so wrong in doing that. That's how I process information. It's one of the ways I'm sitting there like, yeah, libertarians should want to make money, so why don't they?
Yeah.
Right. And I think there is merit to this. I think this idea that are you pro-liberty or anti-state? And I think we might be seeing a burgeoning divide in that realm. And I don't think that Matt Erickson and Dave Smith are on different sides of that debate.
Right.
I think they're both pro-liberty. Mm-hmm. So but I think there are people who might be listening to this who, if you take a step back and you kind of remove the fact that Matt tends to be a little bombastic, you might be like, maybe I do make too much of my identity, right? And I like talking about identity in a philosophical context. Maybe I do make too much of my identity in opposition to the state. The same way in which a Republican, and I say this as a former, liberty Republican, Fox News consuming young adult, that too much, the same way a Republican makes everything about the Democrats being a problem. Their existence is about criticizing the Democrats, and the Democrats' existence is about criticizing the Republicans. Like last night, I was telling you, I was like, I ended up kind of helping this group of girls get from one club to another, and they were kind of talking bad about some of the guys in my group, and they're like, yeah, he was so mean, and he was, and they're all conservatives, and it's just like, okay, for the love of God, this is at 2 a.m, everybody's drunk, and the girl then looks at me because they forgot I was standing right next to them, and she's like, are you a conservative or a Republican? And I go like, and I kind of was just like, what kind of a question is that? I just looked at her right in the eyes. I'm like, what kind of a question is that? And then I kind of chuckled and said, I'm far more dangerous than a Republican. And just, kept walking and kept trying to get these, literally gave woman my shoes because she couldn't walk in her frickin' heels and was complaining like a 3-year-old. And it's, yeah. So this is the way people interact with things. And, yeah, I do individualism. That's what I do. I think it's better. And I think it's a natural tendency of human thought to automatically categorize things in terms of us and them, right? Like, who are we? Who are they? These are the reason why that language is so vague is because it is so fundamental in a sense. And it is ephemeral in that sense. Who are we? Who are they? What is us? What is them? The in-group and the out-group. And what I think happens in what this demonstrates is the degree to which there actually are, in-groups and out-groups operating within a various in-group, which is obvious, but also just demonstrates the complexity of what we're actually driving at here. And notice I've made no claims about any of specific points of what anybody has said, really, save the ones that I've made about like, this taxation issue, this taxation question, or this wealth building question.
I think part of the conflict, I guess, if it even is one, is libertarian theory hasn't really evolved much since Democracy: The God That Failed. Mm-hmm. We're seeing some stuff with the nature of corporations right now. Konkin dealt with that decades ago, but it hasn't really entered the Rothbardian tradition until just now with the rise of what Michael Rechtenwald calls the Google archipelago.
Mm-hmm.
And so could it just be that people are getting bored? And God, I've been libertarian or like identified as libertarian for almost a decade now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of getting tired of all the same arguments. So maybe now we should just start arguing about practical stuff rather than theoretical stuff.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I really do. I think that's actually what's happening. And I don't think, I said this in my soon-to-be-released interview with Adam Patrick, there's nothing wrong with wanting to move ideas forward, right? There's nothing wrong with saying, okay, so we have this, libertarianism was developed, 50 years ago, roughly?
Mm-hmm.
The Libertarian Party is 50 years. Rothbard was writing maybe a little bit before that. He's Mr. Libertarian as far as most people are concerned, or at least in an American context, certainly. So, it's not even a century old, the thought. And it was one person, a brilliant man's ideas about something, and we're trying to live those out. The same way in which Rothbard took Mises and tried to extrapolate from there. The frame that I view the world in is more that progression. We tend to get, I think, because we're limited creatures, and maybe because of maybe because most people are more interested in history than philosophy. People tend to think in terms of strict dates. So this era was from 1945 to 1946. But only in the summer months. And that's what, that's all libertarianism can be, to kind of like mix metaphors. There is a progression here from, broader liberalism, which was a emergent social order that just sort of happened, that was then usurped, this is the way I would put it, usurped by the socialistic world order. Progressivism in the American context is how you would understand this. And what we saw as a consequence of that was the distillation of the liberalism ideas into libertarianism. Okay, so what is this thing? So we had this really nice thing that we call liberalism, right? There's the early years of capitalism, this massive wealth explosion, a huge increase in the standard of living for the average person. How do we protect that? How do we exemplify that? Okay, how do we boil that down into the most necessary things? How about self-ownership and non-aggression? Okay, let's take those, both those ideas seem really, really good. Let's take those and try to apply them in a political context. And so we're 50, 60 years in. Why shouldn't we be having discussions of praxis? Why shouldn't we be having discussions of how do you actually implement these things in the life? And why shouldn't we expect some disagreement amongst people interpreting this? Because Rothbard and Hayek didn't get along, right? We have this whole, Reason and Mises, the Reason magazine and the Mises Institute, they don't talk to each other, but they both ostensibly say the same idea. This is, I think this is justification for my conception of identity as being a paradox of a kind. And so contending with that kind of, I think, is contending with that has been kind of it's the gravitational pull for a lot of the work for a lot of the stuff that I've been writing. Are we tracking so far? Is that like, tell me what you think about that? Because this is like shaky theory ground for me as far as laying this stuff out. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because you made a good, and sorry, but because one more point though, because you made it earlier, like of just like fanboying. When I do an interview, I like to do a little intro where I say a good conversation is like jazz. Uh-huh. There's something to be said for, a podcaster is somebody who knows how to have a conversation. Let's say that that's a skill, a requisite skill for podcasting, right? There's something to be said if you're a musician and you're jamming with somebody, and if you're a dancer and you're dancing with somebody and it clicks, it's one of the most euphoric experiences in the world. If you're artists know this. Anybody who's an artist who's collaborated, if you're like singing with somebody and you guys hit the harmony right, it's one of the coolest feelings in the world. Mm-hmm. When you have like that, and you as a viewer, you can appreciate this too, even if you don't participate. There's something to be said for that in the podcasting realm. And the natural comedic tendency, if you will, is to say yes and that exists within the podcasting space before. So it's very easy to kind of let yourself get carried away in the moment when you're in, because, when we're in this mode of podcasting, it's very different than when we're kind of like sitting around a couch sipping a drink and just having a casual conversation. We're trying to be on. So again, if you're not careful, you can kind of find yourself suddenly like, whoa, how did this conversation get to where it is? Right? And to the case of the Liberty lockdown, why are we talking about martyrdom? For the love of God, people. Like, this is like, don't talk to me about martyrdom. You don't know what that means. And frankly, I don't know that you understand the consequences of it. So let's be careful when we're using words like this. Let's be careful. Again, this is just a cautionary thing. Be careful if you're a new member of the Christian faith, or if you found God. I'm envious of you, frankly. If that's true, then I wish all the best for you. But if you want to try and take God and reintroduce him to the political space, okay, let's take Chesterton's fence for a second. You think there might have been a reason why the Enlightenment chose to do that? That doesn't mean there's not value and meaning in religion. That means that, hey, maybe this isn't the best idea. And I do think we're seeing some of that in these different players. Is that self-discipline, is that self-control element of it that I think comes with time. And the incentive structure of podcasting isn't really there to warrant that temerity, if you will.
I think, so getting back to theory versus praxis, not getting back to, you were talking about it, but, the communist revolution came around 50 years after the publication of Das Kapital.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does worry me a little bit that we're having these fiery conflicts about the nature of libertarianism and its application in the real world. We joke about, the Boogaloo Boys and wearing our Hawaiian shirts and stuff like that. I don't know if you were at the Libertarian Party convention last year, but half the Mises Caucus was there in Hawaiian shirts. They weren't carrying or anything like that, as far as I know. But that's a very real possibility that Vin and Matt are right, that this is going to turn into a radical, violent movement. And where do we go from there? I mean, if we somehow, stage some sort of revolution in the same vein of, Lenin, who was just acting on Marx's treatise that didn't call for revolution, I don't think. As far as I know, the Marxian sort of progression was supposed to be a natural progression, not a burn it all down right now type progression.
Mm-hmm. That's such a good point. Yeah, because it was, and it's the same thing that the progressives did with eugenics, which is to say, evolution is pretty cool. Now let's speed evolution up.
Yeah.
Right. So, communism sounds pretty great. Let's make communism happen right now. This is
libertarianism sounds great. We want to take over the world so that we can leave you alone. But there's a lot that comes along with taking over the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's so there's a generational element, but then there's also an age element as well to this, which is to say, you studying ideas at 20 is different than you studying ideas at 30. And I say that as somebody who's pushing 30. There's a big difference between living in the university system, which is kind of created as this little corral for you to go and have fun with, but you can't do anything outside of it. And then we have the internet, to where in the past you might have, libertarianism is interesting, but I live in Texas and everyone here's a Republican, so I'm just going to be a Republican.
Yeah.
I'm just going to be I was a libertarian when I was in my 20s, but now I'm a conservative. Where that was the impetus, maybe 10, 20 years ago before the internet. Now, with the internet, we've built there is this, for better or worse, there is this community of people who are built around these ideas. And we're talking people we're talking in the thousands at the very least, maybe even more. And we can connect and we can push the ideas forward together with the technological revolution. But then we keep, and it's almost like we keep looking around and being like, wait, why isn't everybody else like me? When, I don't think you should look at the world and say everybody should look like me, right? I think that's the mistake. That to me is the egalitarian delusion. There is a danger, of course. There is a danger in saying, okay, so how do we actually get power? Right? Because there is safety. And liberty people who want safety. There is safety There is safety in being the exception, right? There is safety in being the exception because you are not the rule.
Mm-hmm.
There is safety in being the person who is always in opposition to things. This is you could level this critique at me as saying like, okay, well you claim skepticism. Doesn't that always mean you're going to be on the top of the fence? And the answer is yeah, kinda. But that's where I'll like, well, right. But that's where I'll say, but I am going to put myself out there.
Yeah.
Right. And so I am.
There's safety in it in a liberal society. I mean, there's significant danger in being the exception if you're in a homogeneous society like communism or fascism or whatever. Is that right?
Let's look at the last 18 months. Haven't we seen that homogeneity assert itself?
Mm-hmm.
And don't we in turn feel like outsiders? I certainly do. I'm very careful. Like I speak very freely. I will speak very freely to anyone who wants to listen, but I am very careful with just speaking freely to rant to strangers now. Mm-hmm. Whereas 5 or 6 years ago, I wouldn't be. I think some of that is a consequence of age, like I said, but some of it is a consequence of the times, is understanding that people are so programmed now. If you are plugged into the corporate narrative, you are so ginned up against the same way in which people, it's the same freaking thing in our minds. It's the same impetus to say, well, screw you, taxation is theft, I don't want to make money. Like, it's not just about building wealth. It's like, obviously it's not just about building wealth, but I'm going to react against that. It's the same thing in which, oh, you must be an anti-vaxxer. You must be, you must be a Republican. Are you a Republican? And if you're a Republican, you might be a Trump supporter. Right? Because he's a boogeyman.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's a boogeyman. So this is, I think there's justification for us to feel this way, given the world we find ourselves in. And, I think you're seeing some people push, and that's where we have this post-libertarian nomenclature, term that's coming to light, which is, kind of interesting, but I think it's going to run into the same problems as postmodernism, which is it's very ripe for capture.
Yeah.
Because it's very ripe for capture.
And it's undefinable, a lot like postmodernism.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my main critique of postmodernism, is that you've got Jordan Peterson and what's his face, the objectivist who wrote the book Postmodernism, on one hand, saying that postmodernism means this, and Michael Rechtenwald also falls into that camp. But then on the other hand, you've got, Thad Russell, like actually quoting Foucault to you, saying, no, this is what postmodernism means. And take it from me, I'm a postmodernist. Mm-hmm. I mean, the same would go for a post-libertarian thing. I hear Adam Patrick, I think, is kind of embracing this title. And what he says is a little bit different from what like Matt Erickson says. If Matt Erickson is even a post-libertarian. I mean, I guess maybe Curtis Yarvin is like the proto-post-libertarian, being that he came from a Hoppian background and then became, this monarchist. I don't really know where I'm going with that, but to me, post-libertarianism is just it's like a spook at this point. It doesn't mean anything.
Well, it's kind of, but it's saying that, hey, if I'm going to interpret that charitably, right, what I'm hearing very intelligent people say in the space right now, who are, like someone like Pete Quinones is very, he's a very interesting thinker, and frankly, far more interesting now to me than he was a couple of years ago, as he's kind of like pushed beyond the boundaries of strict, anarcho-capitalism dogma.
Totally.
And it is a dogma, right? There is a dogmatic element to anarcho-capitalism. The same way in which there's a dogmatic element to anarcho-communism and any kind of strict interpretation of a set of ideas. And and I would say, again, given that the last thing I am is a libertarian, that propensity for dogmatism comes before you discover the ideas of libertarianism, just for how I conceptualize things and how I think other people should. I don't, like I said, the important part is I don't think there's anything wrong with questioning, right? In fact, it's kind of what I like to do. And I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to push things forward. And what I see is people saying, well, it might be, as much as I would love to end the wars in Yemen tomorrow, I don't know if I can. I remember people saying this to me when Trump was first elected. And it would be like, what can I do about any of this, right? What can we as an individual actually do to move the ship of humanity, if it even is a ship? Like, how do you actually redirect it? And can you? And maybe we can't, because we don't have the institutional power. So you can either go after those institutions, or you can build some of your own. And we saw one example of this in, like, the rise of, like, the think tanks and the media outlets and stuff like that. And I think we're seeing, I think in part, and maybe I'm wrong. And like I said, there's danger of capture here. If people are listening to this, I hope that they hear me when I say, be really careful when you start quoting the word of God in this political context, because you're either because you're triggering things in people that maybe you do understand, and you just, and you're willing to take the risk of it, but there's a danger there. This is how to use an extreme example, this is how Jonesville happens, right? It is the beginning point of, like, where you can create this particular cult. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I'm using that in a technical sense. This particular cult of people that in turn, actually, maybe you just end up where you started, where you still have this insular little club that's not interested in expanding ideas beyond that. But this isn't to say don't go for it. And this is the final point that I wanted to make with this is there's the generational elements at play here too. Where here we are, is like you said, you've been a libertarian for 10 years. I'm getting close to that at this point. Why shouldn't we see a progression of thought within the school? Why shouldn't we see people trying to, change and update elements for the times? Because times change, right? Like, the application of ideas is specific to the time and place in which they exist. We could, what good is a conversation about freedom of speech in a village of 20 people?
Yeah,
probably not a big one, because you're going to know those 20 people because they're all your cousins.
Yeah. And I mean, even if that village of 20 people, like, has in their village bylaws or whatever that we respect the freedom of speech, the social pressure is going to be there not to speak your mind. I mean, to speak your mind diplomatically at the very least.
Which we're doing in this conversation.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, it's way different. Like you say, what's your thing about Twitter?
Twitter is constant Twitter is constant in-group signaling that the out-group sees.
Yeah. So, and if we had, like, our own little Liberty Twitter, I think that the conversation would be completely different from the way it looks on, like, actual Twitter right now. I think. I mean, we probably wouldn't be as mean to each other.
See, I think that's what Twitter does. Like the point, like, one of the things of Twitter is to, how did I put this? The point of Twitter, like, the problem, like, Twitter, because you can read, if you choose ignorance, you can ascribe whatever context you wish. And there's nothing more ignorant than taking 140 words that somebody says and assuming everything about them. Now, that's fun, because you can then dunk on people and signal to your in-group, right? Like, that's very fun to do. This is, like, I wrote about that the Steven Crowder situation last week, where he went on the H3 podcast, and then, like, Sam Cedar does the surprise thing. And everyone's just like, and it seemed like a lot of the people were like, well, Steven Crowder sucks, but so does the other guy. It's kind of like, yeah, okay. But as a creator, as somebody who does a show, and, like, there's an element of professionalism about it. And I don't think that was very professional. Right? Yeah. I don't think it was very professional to do what the guy Ethan did. And I don't think there's anything wrong with somebody like Crowder, who has a big show, to say, all right, no, I'm not talking to you. This isn't what I agreed to do.
All right. And that having been said, let's bring on my surprise second guest, Cyprian. Welcome to the show.
I would love to, I would really do, because I would really love to speak with Cyprian, because I really don't know anything of his thought. And I want to, I don't know if I would love to, but I wouldn't be opposed to. Let me be more precise. Because I don't want to ascribe too much to him based off my perception of him. But I'll be honest, my perception of him is not positive.
Sure.
Like, that's just my initial perception of him. That doesn't mean I'm right. It doesn't mean he's wrong. It just means that maybe we wouldn't be friends.
I think if you're interested, actually, go check out his series from, like, 2017 or so, called the oh God, I forgot the name of it. But basically, he's going through the kind of proto fourth turning cyclical view of history. The Ascendant Project, that's the name of it. And then listen to his interviews with Pete Q from last year talking about the dim age. And you've got a pretty firm grasp on why he's saying what he's saying now. I think you have to separate the wheat from the chaff a little bit on that. He's, in my opinion,
let me make a point on that real quick. That is always the case.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Totally.
So it's something. It is, and I'm not. It's one of those things that are simple. It's simple yet profound, but it's also simple. It is always the case that we are separating. You should always be separating the wheat from the chaff. You should always make. You should make sure that the people that you surround yourself with are good people. Like, this is in a cosmic. If you want to put it in a cosmic sense, fine. The cosmic sense, if we're going to be Christians about it, that's for God. That's not for me to decide. And I won't speak for God. Thank you very much.
Well, and I went from a complete Vin Armani fanboy to literally calling him an asshole on Twitter, like tagging him in everything.
Sure. But here we are talking about him.
Yeah, exactly. Because, weak minds talk about people. Let's bring it back to ideas.
Let's do it.
And actually, I think I was reading that quote because you talked about earlier, you said that people prefer history to philosophy. And that makes sense. Average minds talk about events and strong minds talk about ideas. I think probably galaxy brains talk about putting those ideas into practice. So like future events, maybe.
Yeah, I think I've said this on your show, but I'll say it again because it's really important. That was actually, I used to be somebody that was way too caught up in theory. Yeah. And it was life experience of getting a job in in the manufacturing world. That was this complete 180 from this, more academic and retail background that I had. It was like, no, it actually does matter that your crane is working properly because you've got 10,000 pounds of steel holding it up. And if that falls, that crushes a man and he dies. And, and there's been, thankfully, none that I've been around for. I haven't had to witness it. But I hear stories of machine malfunction and a guy got his arm, a young guy, like a 22-year-old kid got his arm cut off, because he was wearing too baggy of a shirt and it got caught in a machine. Somebody getting, a truck driver getting crushed because he wasn't paying attention when they were loading his truck and all the material fell off over him. Yeah. So it is practice. There is only practice. It's all well and good for us to have the philosophical conversation. And I love having the philosophical conversation, but I recognize the importance of putting it into practice because without action, we only have thought, and thought thought is just this thing that we do in abstracto, and it has no consequence. If you have no practice or application to your ideas, then you are of no consequence because you're not actually doing anything. You're just kind of you're just the monkey hitting the button that's stimulating your brain.
Yeah.
And you can do that as a smart person. You don't have to be a dummy for that to be the case. You can do that. You can be a smart person and still hit that button.
Yeah. Let's switch gears a little bit. You wrote these pieces, and actually you've brought it up in saying the last thing you are is a libertarian on intersectionality. And I not to toot my own horn, but on August 29th, 2017, I posted this in the Tom Woods Show Elite Facebook group. I put a link to the uses and abuses of intersectionality, and it's written by a feminist author at newstatesman.com. And I said, I'm writing something about intersectionality, so of course I'm reading about it first. This article stood out. I thought it was interesting. If she took it about 2 more steps, she'd be advocating decentralization and individualism. And so I came to that conclusion 3 years before you did. So kudos to me. Why don't you talk a little bit about intersectionality and what it is and what its logical conclusion is?
So my understanding, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert per se, but definitely more well-read than the average person. So I'm not a James Lindsay and I'm not a Kimberly Crenshaw. And there's 2 points because there's always the philosopher and then the follower. There's always the person who puts the thought forward, and then there's the people who take that thought and run with it. Which is, by the way, something that we're witnessing both in terms of Dave Smith and Matt Erickson. For the record, this is a natural human thing that we do. So Kimberly Crenshaw was a legal academic, and I believe it was a paper she wrote in 1999 entitled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Policies. She lays out, and so I'm just going to read the quote because it would probably be best, because this is like what I found. This is part of her introduction, so this should hopefully give us something. So she says, I will discuss how it contributes to the marginalization of Black women in feminist theory and anti-racist politics. I argue that Black women are sometimes excluded from feminist theory and anti-racist policy discourse because both are predicated on a discrete set of experiences that often does not accurately reflect the interaction of race and gender. These problems of exclusion cannot be solved by simply including Black women within an already established analytical structure. Because the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism, any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which Black women are subordinated. Thus, for feminist theory and anti-racist policy discourse to embrace the experiences and concerns of Black women, the entire framework that has been used as a basis for translating, quote, women's experience or, quote, the Black experience into concrete policy demands must be rethought and recast. In other words, as I write in my piece, critical race theory teaches us about how pervasive racism is, and feminist theory teaches us about how pervasive sexism is, but both discriminate at the intersection of Black women. The ways in which society discriminates against that group is unique. The idea certainly has been expanded now from that narrow legal interpretation, but it belongs to a school of thought that thinks the world is only about conflict and subjugation of one group under another. And that's the crux of it. So to summarize and reword it one more time so that it sticks, women are discriminated against, Black men are discriminated against, but also Black women are discriminated against, and that's different in the way in which Black men are discriminated against, and women, generally speaking, white women are discriminated against. So we need to have this intersectional model where we actually examine each unique portion of each unique portion of the identity, so that we can understand the way in which that might manifest itself in discrimination law or anti-racism, as she says there. Now, the impetus or the inspiration for this piece came from listening to Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau talk. And, so like, I didn't figure that. I'm just reinterpreting Jordan Peterson here in a sense.
Yeah.
Because, and I'll read the quote from him. And because he kind of says, like, I think I was doing the math the other day is how he talks about it in the interview. And if you go to beenawake.com, it is behind a paywall, but between now and September 9th, I am offering a lifetime discount of 50% for people who want to, give me some money to help support my work, to help spread my message, and to help bring better sense making to the world. But so you can go and read this if you want. I have the YouTube video clip played as well. But so here's Jordan Peterson. So again, I'm not pretending to be amazing, right? I'm putting ideas together so that people can consume them. How many categories, this is Jordan Peterson speaking, how many categories do you need to add in an intersectional analysis before you're actually down to 1 in a billion? Let's use 100 as an example. If you have 6 categories with a probability of 0.1, then you're 1 in a billion. So you need just 6 dimensions of intersectionality before you fractionated the population down to the level of the individual. So that means the individual comes sneaking back into the collective ideas of postmodernism. He says postmodernism, We would better understand this as intersectionality, once you hit 6 intersectional categories. So if you're a multiracial woman, bisexual, 27 years old, smart, 30th percentile for attractiveness, 10th percentile for family wealth, and 80th percentile for education, you're the only one in the world like that. So intersectionality, if I was, the whole piece is, I would think, very well laid out. I tried to write it in a more philosophical lens, which is to say it's a little on the dense side purposefully so that you're kind of thinking through everything. I look at it, to be simple about it, I kind of look at it like this. All intersectionality accomplishes is inverting the racial hierarchy that progressivism established.
Do you think that there's utility in that, though?
In what specifically?
Do you think that there's legitimate utility in breaking society down into these not quite individual parts, into race, into gender, into race as it relates to gender. I mean, to me, I was actually just talking to James Riley about this. It'll be the episode that comes out just prior to this one, I believe.
Okay.
I think a lot of the reason that libertarians have not gained political power is that we are a bunch of white men, for the most part, who don't have skin in the game. Yeah, we don't like taxes, but what the hell? I mean, it's not like we're starving due to taxation. We don't like war, but it's not like we're the ones being bombed. On the other hand, and we don't like cops. When a white person is killed by a cop, it's shocking because it's not normal. When a black person is shot by a cop, it's normal, and the shocking thing is that it's not shocking. I think that that's a legitimate thing to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't necessarily have a problem with, to an extent, I guess, I don't have a problem with the progressive narrative, the woke narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I wish that they weren't as authoritarian about it as they are. I wish that I think that there's a lot of hyperbole in it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's legitimate. Like I live in a predominantly black neighborhood. We don't have cops driving down the street all the time. I have never felt unsafe by my neighbors or by the cops.
Yeah.
That said, I might, having come from an upper middle class white background, maybe I just don't notice stuff that my neighbors notice.
It's possible. So is there merit? Sure. Of course there is. Like, of course, it's worth focusing on the individual, right? It's what intersectionality, which is part of a broader which is part of the broader critical school of thought, right? Critical theory. And critical theory is a derivation of Marxism, and Marxism is a derivation of Hegelianism. Yeah, there is, of course, merit to try and understanding the plight of marginalized people, if we want to put it in language like that. That's not the point of my piece. The point of my piece is that we don't need intersectionality to accomplish that, because what we need is individualism. And what intersectionality and the broader critical theory does is it necessarily pits groups against each other. And perhaps there are going to be groups at odds, groups at odds within society. But I don't think it follows from that those groups at odds are necessarily racial in nature. But I recognize the historical precedent of what the larger American story is as it relates to racial segregation and racialist thinking. Mm-hmm. Again, what does intersectionality actually do? Well, it just says the most oppressed person is the best, based off this early 20th century notion about a hierarchy of races that was established by people who didn't understand what they were talking about. Right? They were wrong.
So is that baked in? I have not read the article that you cited, Kimberly Crenshaw's paper. Is that hierarchy of, that victim hierarchy, I guess, is that part of her theory, or is that something that's evolved since she wrote that in 1999?
I would
obviously
say
it exists.
It's part of the evolution.
Okay.
Which is why I make the specific point. Because you read that, it's an academic paper, and there's, like I said, there is merit there. There is merit to consider the way in which a black woman might be discriminated against in the legal field that is maybe slightly different than a white woman or a black man. That's a logical thing. Let's explore it. What Jordan Peterson points out, and what I will back up, is once we reach 6 levels of intersectionality, we're back at the level of the individual. You're at 1 in a billion. As far as like what that represents in mathematical terms. So it's not that it's a very nuanced point, right? Mm-hmm. Because, you were talking about political power. This isn't a matter of politics. This is a matter of understanding the world in and of itself, I would say, and how you should approach the world as well, and how you should then in turn examine the world. And I think the obvious solution to this is Mises's methodological individualism, is to make the point, right? It's not just that we're taking this, individual is an esoteric thing. We're making the point of saying when we examine a social issue, we're going to start at the unit of the individual and see how that plays off. And that would obviously incorporate seeing the way in which different individuals have the different individuals' experiences differ. It incorporates that. The reason why intersectionality in part I think exists again is what is the tradition of thought there? The tradition of thought there is the polylogism. The tradition of thought there is the fact that there will always be an oppressor and an oppressed. There will always be groups fighting against each other, and it wasn't the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, so now it's going to be race and gender. And perhaps most importantly, from the standpoint of the evolution of thought, there are people who want power who will corrupt that. Will corrupt the maybe noble notion in Kimberly Crenshaw's piece. I won't speak to her state of mind because I don't know it. There will be people searching for power, specifically in a leftist context, right? It's this. That's the element that's the problem, and then that's at most a problem. And so the second half of my piece, what I do is I demonstrate in here. I kind of just point out that we see something like this in nature, actually. That, if you're going to create a pulsar map to try and map a point in space, you tend to use like at least 6. I think it's Well, I said that what I said here is, and this is again. So the point here is that intersectionality resolves itself into individualism at 6 degrees. So therefore, why do we need intersectionality? That's my thesis. And I say in the piece, if I was trying to direct you to the Sears Tower in Chicago, I might tell you it's at 233 South Wacker Drive, Chicago, Illinois, 60606. I could also say the building is located at the intersection of West Jackson and South Franklin. To be even more precise, I could use the coordinates 41 degrees, 52 minutes, and 43 seconds north by 87 degrees, 38 minutes, and 9 seconds west. All of these measurements will get you to the same destination, but only one gives a unique enough location that it can be plotted relative to any other point on the Earth. You'll notice that longitudinal coordinates use 6 data points to effectively map the skyscraper's location. Similarly, if we plot the location of a planet in space, we need at least 6 data points. Then there is the case, at least 6 data points. Then there is the case of the Voyager project. The golden record included in the probe created a galactic map by using the nearest pulsars as a way to map our solar system's location. And then, kind of an explanation of what pulsars are. So that's, I think individualism is just by definition a better understanding of how to approach these situations, right? Like the conflict element. Sorry, but just one more point, because the conflict element is then where it is what makes it politically beneficial to people who want power, because then it becomes Black Lives Matter and not Stop Killer Cops, to borrow from Scott Horton.
I understand. Yeah, so I totally get that. Mm-hmm. I think that conflict and power are inevitable, and I also think that in an industrial society where Marx was writing, the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and the capitalists were the natural conflict. We no longer live in that society. It was really tough, and I said this in my last interview. I apologize for repeating this analogy, but I'm saying it for you now. It was really tough to build a factory. You couldn't just go buy, like the average Joe on the street could not go buy a factory. The average Joe on the street now can publish a website. He can make a lot of money on YouTube. So it's no longer about the economic class of people. But there are still people who are downtrodden. And a lot of that aligns with their race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, that kind of thing. So I don't necessarily know that it was like like Dave Smith a lot of times says that the Occupy Wall Street movement so threatened the powers that be that they had to take the focus off of these economic classes and make it about race. And I think that there's merit to that argument. And I think it was very convenient for them that it did change from economic class to race. But that doesn't, to me, mean that these conflicts don't exist or that they're completely fabricated.
Do you think that I'm arguing that?
I think you might be. If you're not, then...
No. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I wasn't sure. So I wouldn't say that they're imagined. Like, I don't think that the collective experience of the Black community, Black Americans. There's this element. This is a political problem, in that politics is the problem. Not that it's something for politics to solve. Where you know what? Let me do it this way. But what were we discussing before we got into this? We're talking about theory, and then we're talking about the application.
Yep.
And we're talking about the application of this. The application of the broader critical theory and Marxism in general, and even if you want to get even more general, maybe even leftism, to me is one of the most is like the worst thing in the world you could do for people. Mm-hmm. We started this episode talking about mindset and how empowering I find. And I don't care if you don't like this, then don't listen to me. There's billions of people on this earth. You don't have to listen to me, and that's completely fine. But I found it empowering to take responsibility for my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you hear these Black dads and moms too at school board meetings all the time, talking about how you're abusing my kids by telling them that they're victims. Stop it.
And you know what? Here's the other thing, James. It's like I know a lot of really smart people who happen to be of African descent, which is to say, I know a lot of smart Black people. I know a lot of smart Mexican people. I know a lot of smart people from all walks of life. And I never grew up in a world where I thought about what somebody looked like before I thought about who they were. Maybe that just means I was raised better than most. I don't know. But that was never. This has never been a part of my consciousness is this person going to do this or that? I'm not. Again, sorry. I'm kind of like all over the place because I'm trying to make sure I'm being careful here. But there are countless middle class Americans who happen to be Black who have achieved a massive amount of wealth for themselves, and they didn't do it by being a parasite on the system and preaching intersectionality. They did it by working hard. Mm-hmm. And I don't think, and Thomas Sowell does this, I think, better than anybody else, given, and it was just his 91st birthday, and God bless that man. He deserves all the rest in the world, and it is a tragedy that he will not go down as one of the foremost American minds of the 20th century, because he won't, unless we can bring him to the fore. But he talks about it very well, what it was like growing up. I believe he grew up in Harlem. Hopefully I didn't get that wrong. Sorry if I did. But he talks about it very well. I don't think there's anything about being Black that means you can't get ahead, if that makes sense. And again, we're talking about the practice, and we're talking about the implication of this. This intersectionality, in that is it applied, in that I recognize it. I'm not, maybe I'm wrong. I can always be wrong. And I'm sure if I was talking to somebody who was an expert in this field, like a Mark Lamont Hill, that, he could talk about pedagogical norms and why it's necessary to have these sort of discourses so that we can create a great understanding. Fantastic, dude. I love the academic discussion. Let's get back to the practice. What does this look like in practice? In practice, this is pitting people against each other for arguably no good reason, because we can still understand the plight of an individual and try to come to some kind of conclusion and some kind of resolution to that matter. But people want the conflict, I think. Or better said, people in power want the conflict because it perpetuates their power. I don't know. Maybe I'm not being clear. I can't tell.
Given that it seems like human nature is geared towards tribalism and us versus them. Mm-hmm. What does practical individualism look like within that context?
Mm-hmm. I think it recognizes that fact, and so you guard against that becoming too rigid. Mm. So that's the way I would put it. Like, kind of just talking about my own personal experience and how I've grown up. It's one of those funny things where it's like I'll look around at my friends and be like, oh, this is we're actually a pretty multi-ethnic bunch. How about that? Like it just happens organically because I surround myself with people that are interested in ideas. And so that's what I'm interested in doing. I've talked about Nietzsche's conception of the herd, and I wrote a piece. And this is kind of nascent and it's not completely fleshed out, but it's like I wrote this thing where I said, find your herd. I don't think there's anything wrong I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting your own tribe. And if your own tribe includes people of your particular ethnic makeup because that's what you're comfortable with, I might not love it. It might not be my choice, but I can. But again, but I think in the basic context of how do we get along in a multi-ethnic, multiracial society, I think you have to recognize that people are naturally going to do that in certain instances. Mm. But it also is. But individualism is also the means by which you can move beyond that too, because you can see this individualism is maybe a philosophical idea that incorporates a Christian element entirely, right? Because the other way we see this in part done is through like a religion like Catholicism, or maybe pre-Vatican II, but certainly Catholicism has this necessary universal element versus Protestantism, which is kind of like bifurcated into a million different sects. Whereas Catholicism has all those sects inside of it.
Yeah. So does libertarianism, for that matter.
Right. Well, and then there are people saying that libertarianism is Christianity without God.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
Well, people say that about progressivism too.
And they're right in both cases.
I know.
Because, they're right in both cases because either God exists and so therefore, he created the world, blah, 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 or Christianity has had a profound impact on Western civilization. Christianity and Hellenistic philosophy, right? The Socratic method that's the melody and the counter melody of Western civilization. That's what it is. That's the basis for it. The ideas at the center of it are what has built Western civilization to be what it is, with all of its pimples and blemishes and all that stuff. I don't see that. I will say that too about this larger conversation of saying like, oh, well, libertarianism is Christian. Yeah, of course, because we're in the West, because most of you were raised in the Catholic, were raised Christian, because we live in the Christian world. We live in Christendom. We might not call it that today, but that is your who says this better than anybody else is Camille Paglia, right? Because she talks about how she's an atheist, but she thinks that the Bible should be taught. Because that's the foundation for Western civilization. And if you don't understand the Bible, you don't understand the society that you live in. You don't understand the civilization that you find yourself in. And now let's get a little more granular because we're really, really big. If you start with the wrong questions, you're going to end up with the wrong conclusions, right? So it's like, oh, well, if I say that the world is a horrible place and everybody's racist, and so I'm going to act in the world, as if everybody I come across is a racist. Think that you might find some people that will react against that because of the various body cues that you're giving in different contexts. Like if you have you ever been mad and walk into a place and then be happy and walk into a place? Have you noticed that it's different? Right? Have you noticed that if you start your day, like seriously, this is the practical everyday thing. Have you noticed that when you start your day having a bad day, that the rest of the day doesn't go very well? The other day I was like sitting in traffic and there was an accident and I didn't move for 30 minutes and I started to have I had like a mini panic attack of like, oh my God, there's so many people. I just want to live in the middle of nowhere. Right. And I got home and I'll be honest, I wasn't that productive when I got home that day because I was I got out of myself.
That's like all of 2020 for me.
Yeah. Right. Or like I didn't get a good night's sleep. And so when my coffee spilled all over me, and then my coffee spilled all over me as I left the house. Like, and I had to change my shirt, and so I was late to an appointment. Like, if you look, what's funny is I've been, given the fact that everybody's kind of that they're talking about religion is cool again, I've actually been meditating on the Bible verse, seek and ye shall find. Because I think there's a huge practical element to this of, again, if you are, let's say, if you go out and think every white person is racist, I think you're going to find a racist.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you're going to notice a racist before you notice the 20 other people who are just passive to you.
One of Curtis Yarvin's best points, I think, is if you want to create a bunch of Nazis, just tell people that they're Nazis. Like if you're a fourth grader and you're called to the school counselor's office and excoriated for your racism when you're not really a racist, I mean, there's a really good chunk of 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds who are going to take that message and be like, you know what? If you want me to be a Nazi, I'll just be a Nazi. Fine.
Yeah.
It's, So,
well, I must be that because everybody is. And by the way, that's what I'm talking about. That it just inverts the racial hierarchy.
Yeah.
Because what did progressivism tell Black Americans at the beginning of the 20th century? You are less than. You don't. You can't marry a white. You can't have property. You can't do all of these things. It's all it is I've said racism is the oldest and most persistent method of social control in America.
Yeah.
All we're doing is changing the focus of the racism, man. It's still stupid to keep insisting upon these racial categories.
And it's still disempowering Black people.
Yeah. Well, it's you know what? But see, I don't know if it's disempowering some, but there's a lot of Black Americans who are getting very wealthy out of this. Right?
Yeah, that's true. They're not maybe not as wealthy as the very white Robin DiAngelo. But.
Correct. And I hope and I look forward one day. I mean, I think I'm not so what's the word? I'm not dumb. So like I get that two, Caucasian guys having this conversation makes it different, right? And frankly, I would have if I can't wait till, I get to a point where I can sit across from maybe somebody who is a little bit more on the intersectional scale, and we can try and have a conversation and see if we can remove ourselves from ideological possession to come to some sort of agreement. Here's an interesting thought that I've had recently. There is this one thing we are witnessing, and I think it says the power of the internet, and it's actually a pretty cool thing, is the elevation of Black consciousness, of the American Black experience and American Black consciousness. And there's an element of this that is entirely positive, right? Because talk about a people. I know, I don't know if this stat is accurate, but I've heard it before that if you took the wealth of Black Americans, strictly Black Americans, that it would be like the 10th wealthiest nation on earth. Like just that by itself. So, I mean, like it's a pretty rich group of people. But we're seeing this elevation of this Black narrative, and the Black narrative was built as being, going back to a point we made before, as being the exception. Right? They were the slaves. They were the less than. They were the outcasts of society. They were designed, it was engineered to be that way by the government, by people in power. I would not deny any of that, obviously. And
importantly, by the labor movements.
Yes, the labor movements too. That's a fantastic point. And then the book that everybody should read if you haven't already is Thomas Leonard's Illiberal Reformers, Race and Eugenics in the Progressive Era. And it lays a lot of this stuff out really well in an economic historical take. But we have this elevation of the Black consciousness, of the Black narrative, if you will. And this narrative is entirely hung up on the idea of being out of power, right? So and now a lot of those people are starting to gain some semblance of power in institutions like universities and so on. What tools do they have at their disposal? They have the tools, if you will. We can quibble with this, but I will call it, we have the tools of progressivism, right? We have the tools of this socialistic, central authority, centralized planning mentality. So they take those tools and they run with it. Why wouldn't they? That's what we do as humans. Most of these people haven't been exposed to the ideas of liberalism as espoused by Locke, right? In fact, they're saying we shouldn't be teaching people like Aristotle anymore because Aristotle talks about slavery in the wrong way, even though he doesn't. It's a misunderstanding and a misapplication. It's a purposeful misapplication of what the words mean. So that's what I mean when I say that all it does is invert the racial hierarchy established by progressivism. And as far as the last 100 years is concerned, it was progressive ideology that put whites at the top. And yeah, okay, it came a little bit before that, but as most people will point out, not really, because chattel slavery is a very particular institution. And once slavery was abolished, Jim Crow was its own, was its own form of of slavery, I guess, if we want, or legalized discrimination. I'm not sure how I would put that. Which, by the way, not sure how I put that. That's why you should write. If you're, that's why I do write, is so I can put things in a better way. So it doesn't surprise me that that's what people do, because that's the operating paradigm, right? And because that's what the mainstream notion is. And what do they call themselves? Liberals. Right? Because leftist progressivism completely subsumed liberalism in America. It completely replaced it, and it co-opted it, and to the point where as Hayek talks about in his intro to the Road to Serfdom, as he published, I believe, in 1944. I could be wrong on that. But when it was published in America for the first time, he said, I use the term liberal in its appropriate sense, something to that effect. And that, and that for some curious aspect of American life has created a situation in which liberalism means nothing. So if what we think we are as Americans are broadly liberal people, but we're not practicing liberalism in the correct way, of course we've been led astray, right? The same way in which if you follow a preacher who isn't actually preaching the word of God, who isn't actually concerned with the eternal salvation of his flock, which is what a pastor is supposed to be, the shepherd. Of course that flock will be led astray. And I think there should be humility in understanding these situations, but humility and humility doesn't mean subservience. And everything about intersectionality is about subservience in practice. Mm-hmm. Everything is about subserviating people based off their race, based off the color of their skin, based off where they fall in the hierarchy. And so you say, okay, well, you're just a cis white heterosexual man, so of course you're going to say that. Sure, but wasn't that? And this is that leftist principle that Malice delineates so well, or maybe it wasn't Malice, but he's the one who introduced me to it, which is when I don't have power, I ask for freedom of speech because that's according to your principles. But when I do have power, I take it away because that's according to my principles.
Yeah. So I think the big takeaway from this entire, almost 2-hour conversation.
I knew we were going to hit 2 hours.
I know. is we should be seeking personal empowerment and not institutional power.
Yeah.
And
we should build our own institutions as a consequence.
Yeah. Because I think institutions are probably inevitable. But
yes. And institutions crumble and fail.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe that's the message of Matt Erickson, of Dave Smith, and of our intersectional interlocutors.
Yeah,
well, or at least the best outcome for them.
So we started this concept that when we were talking about intersectionality, you brought up the very valid counterpoint, which is, isn't there something to this? And what I say in the piece in part 2. I quote Human Action from Mises, and I make the point that Mises delineated methodological individualism 50 years before Kimberly Crenshaw ever wrote about intersectionality. Mm. That's not to say Kimberly Crenshaw is wrong to write about intersectionality. I'm saying that it's not the case, and this is what you learn the more you study about history and the more you study about the realm of ideas, is somebody came up with this. The issue wasn't that nobody had this thought. The issue was that thought wasn't being taught. Mm-hmm. Because this person is anathema. Why? Because his ideology isn't suited. The Austrian School of Economics is not suited to run a super large central authority, a super large government that is going to have billions of dollars at its disposal to fund universities. Right? So it's lost to history. But here we are with this technological revolution to where we can examine the stories of the past and we can find the best, and we can carry the best forward. And that's, by the way, that's what libertarianism is in my mind. And that's why I haven't rejected the label, and I probably won't, is because I see it as carrying forward these brilliant ideas about humanity. And I think to your point, what you were saying, what the takeaway is, I just act, man. I try to treat people well. I try to be respectful, but I also try to be the best person I can. And here's the kicker. If you're going to make it you versus me, I'm going to win. So let's not make it you versus me. Let's work together. Right? That's because, and why shouldn't I think that way?
Yeah. Amen to that.
By the way, that you versus me thing is also the most dangerous thing you could say, what I just said. Because if it's you versus me and I'm going to win, that kind of traces to your point of like what actually happens if there's real radicalism present.
Yeah, it does, and also you don't know if you're going to win. I mean, it could be very dangerous for you, even if you're confident in your ability to win.
Yeah, right. Well, but it's also like I'm going to win, and if I lose, then okay, but I'm going to win. So the only way I'm going to lose is if you kill me, right? I will die on my feet.
Mm-hmm.
I will not live on my knees. This is the, like, again, just with these conversations, it's so interesting, and just, and my personal thoughts of like trying to get back, maybe going back to church. It's like, but I remember the stories, right? And I remember, and what are the stories of the Old Testament? At least the ones that's always stuck out to me. The story of Jacob, when the Pharaoh, right? I think I got the story when the Pharaoh asks him to bow before him because he's a god.
Mm-hmm.
And what does he say? I bow to no man. I bow to no man. And I suggest you don't either. But I'll follow somebody who's got the right things to say.
Maybe multiple somebodies.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, let's leave it there because it is getting hot in my office and I want to turn my air conditioner back on. And I'm sure you're in a similar situation. Midwesterners don't tend to have central air in our apartment buildings. So it's all window units, and it gets really hot in the middle of the afternoon in the summer. So cool. Thanks so much, LB, for joining me again. Why don't you plug away what you got to plug?
If you like anything that I've had to say, or even if you don't, please go to beenawake.com, subscribe with your email, follow me on Twitter, and join the conversation. I've been writing for about a year now. My next step is to try and build community around it. And it's hopefully I can accomplish that, but I can only do it if you go to beenawake.com and subscribe with your email.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.
Hell yeah.
All right. Thanks again to LB for joining me today. And of course, thanks as always to you for tuning in. If you haven't already, head over to blackbird.substack.com to sign up with your email address to receive all of the podcast episodes along with any written content that I release. And if you really like the show and you'd like to get early episodes, bonus content, and premium articles, sign up for one of the paid options, and you'll really be supporting me and this project that I'm working on. Don't forget to head to blackbirdpodcast.com/RU-Texas to sign up for Renegade University's Texas Weekend down in Austin with Thad Russell and Buck Johnson, Scott Horton, Hotep Jesus, Cody Wilson, Deirdre McCloskey, and Jack the Perfume Nationalist, along with me and about 100 of our closest friends. I promise you, it's a ton of fun. You're going to meet new people. You're going to eat great food, drink great drinks, and who knows, you might learn something. So with that, this is another episode of Blackbird. I will see you on the next one. And until then, live free.